Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the strange, juicy, and slightly ridiculous history of why 18th century Europeans were absolutely terrified of tomatoes. Imagine this. You're sitting at a grand banquet table, surrounded by powdered wigs, candlelight, and an array of decadent dishes. Someone places a shiny red fruit on your plate plump, vibrant and glistening with dew. You take one bite and, well, you don't die. But if you were an 18th century European, you'd probably think you were about to. Tomatoes, now the foundation of everything from pizza to ketchup, weren't always beloved. In fact, they were once considered dangerous, even deadly. Tonight, we'll explore how this innocent little fruities, it's a fruit managed to terrify an entire continent. Spoiler alert, it involves witchcraft, bad science, and some very unfortunate dinnerware. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It all begins in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, when European explorers were busy discovering the Americas. Among the treasures they brought back were strange new plants, potatoes, corn, cacao, and of course, tomatoes. Native to South America, tomatoes had been cultivated for centuries by the Aztecs and other indigenous peoples, who called them tomato. These small wild fruits were nothing like the giant beefsteaks or perfectly round cherry tomatoes we know today. They were yellowish, about the size of a marble, and often wrinkled more like a tiny, sour plum than anything you'd want to toss into a salad. When Spanish conquistadors brought tomatoes back to Europe in the early 1500s, they were met with curiosity rather than enthusiasm. At first, they were treated as botanical oddities rather than food. Wealthy Europeans, who loved collecting exotic plants, displayed tomatoes in their gardens, alongside other New World imports like tobacco and chili peppers. But eating them, that was another story entirely. You see, the tomato's bright, glossy skin and unusual color made it look suspicious, almost too perfect to be natural. In an era when people were deeply superstitious and often blamed unexplained illnesses on curses or witchcraft, anything unfamiliar could be seen as dangerous. Tomatoes, with their shiny, almost waxy appearance, seemed like the kind of thing a witch might use in a potion. And then there was the name. Botanically, tomatoes belong to the Solanaceae family, also known as nightshades. This group includes some of the most infamous toxic plants in history, like deadly nightshade, Athropa belladonna, henbane, and mandrake. These plants were well known in Europe for their use in poisons and hallucinogenic brews. In fact, deadly nightshade was often called witches' berries. So when European botanists classified tomatoes as part of the nightshade family, it didn't exactly help their reputation. Adding to the tomato's PR problem was its Latin name, Solanum lycopersicum, which translates to wolf peach. The wolf part came from the ancient belief that nightshade plants could summon wolves or werewolves. The peach part? Well, that was just because tomatoes were round and vaguely peach-like. But put it all together, and you've got a fruit that sounds like it belongs in a horror story. Of course, not everyone was afraid of tomatoes. In southern Europe, particularly in Spain and Italy, people were more adventurous when it came to food. They began experimenting with tomatoes, using them in sauces and stews. But in northern Europe, where the climate was colder and the cuisine blander, tomatoes remained a source of suspicion. It didn't help that early attempts to grow tomatoes in northern Europe often failed. Tomatoes are sun-loving plants, and without the warm Mediterranean climate, they struggled to ripen. Unripe tomatoes, which are green and bitter, were even more likely to be mistaken for poisonous. And so, for decades, tomatoes remained a curiosity, a plant to be admired from a distance, but not consumed. But the real turning point in the tomato's reputation came in the 18th century, when wealthy Europeans began to fall mysteriously ill after eating them. Imagine you're an aristocrat at a lavish dinner party. You're served a dish garnished with slices of tomato, and within hours, you're doubled over with stomach pain. Naturally, you'd blame the tomato. But the truth was far more complicated and far more ironic. At the time, wealthy Europeans often dined on pewter plates, which were made from a mix of tin and lead. Tomatoes, being highly acidic, would leach lead from the plates, creating a toxic cocktail. Essentially, it wasn't the tomato that was poisoning people, it was the plates. But in a world where science was still in its infancy, no one made the connection. Instead, tomatoes were branded as dangerous, even deadly. And so, the myth of the poison apple was born. Stories began to circulate about aristocrats who had died after eating tomatoes, their symptoms ranging from violent vomiting to sudden death. These tales only added to the tomato's sinister reputation. Even as southern Europeans continued to embrace the fruit, the rest of the continent remained wary. It's fascinating, isn't it? Something as simple as a tomato, a fruit we now associate with comfort food and summer picnics, was once seen as a potential killer. But as we'll see, the story of the tomato is far from over. The tomato's ominous reputation only deepened as Europeans began to associate it with witchcraft and poison. You've already heard the eerie nickname wolf peach, but let's dig deeper into why that name struck fear into the hearts of 18th century Europeans. To understand, you need to step into their world, a world brimming with superstition, where plants weren't just food or decoration. They were symbols of power, danger, and mystery. Imagine walking through a medieval apothecary. The shelves are lined with dried herbs, powders, and tinctures, many derived from plants in the nightshade family. Deadly nightshade, henbane, and mandrake were staples in the arsenal of healers' sand, allegedly witches. These plants were known for their ability to cause hallucinations, paralysis, and even death in the wrong doses. Mandrake, in particular, was steeped in legend. Its root, often resembling a human figure, was believed to scream when pulled from the ground, cursing anyone who heard the sound. Now picture the tomato sitting innocently among these sinister cousins, its glossy skin practically glowing with unnatural vibrancy. To the untrained eye, it looked like it belonged to the same dangerous family, and, botanically speaking, it did. The nightshade connection was enough to make people suspicious, but the tomato's uncanny resemblance to forbidden fruits in folklore sealed the deal. European folklore was rife with stories of cursed or enchanted fruits. Take the apple, for example, the fruit that supposedly tempted Eve in the Garden of Eden, leading to humanity's downfall. Or the poisoned apple in the tale of Snow White, which brought the princess to the brink of death. These stories weren't just fairy tales. They reflected deep-seated fears about food's ability to harm or corrupt. So when tomatoes arrived in Europe, their resemblance to these mythical fruits didn't go unnoticed. And then there were the witches. In the 18th century, belief in witchcraft was still alive and well, especially in rural areas. Witches were thought to use plants to brew potions and poisons, and many of the plants they allegedly used, like deadly nightshade and mandrake, came from the same botanical family as tomatoes. The idea that tomatoes might be part of a witch's toolkit wasn't far-fetched to the average European. The tomato's name didn't help matters. The Aztecs had called it tomato, but when the Spanish brought it back to Europe, they adapted the name to tomate. This new word sounded exotic and vaguely sinister, especially when paired with the Latin name Lycopersicum, literally wolf peach. Wolves, in European folklore, were symbols of danger, destruction, and the supernatural. They were creatures to be feared, and anything associated with them carried a dark connotation. Historians still argue whether the tomato's bad reputation was purely botanical or if it was amplified by cultural anxieties. Some believe the tomato's association with wolves and witches was a convenient way to explain why people fell ill after eating it. Remember those lead-poisoned pewter plates we talked about earlier? Others think the tomato's uncanny appearance made it a scapegoat for broader fears about foreign plants and foods. After all, the tomato wasn't native to Europe. It came from the Americas, a land that many Europeans still viewed as mysterious and dangerous. But superstition alone doesn't explain why tomatoes were feared. There was also a scientific misunderstanding at play. In the 18th century, botany was still in its infancy, and people didn't fully understand how plants worked. They categorized plants based on appearance and family connections, often lumping harmless species in with toxic ones. The nightshade family was a prime example. While deadly nightshade could kill, other nightshade plants like potatoes, eggplants, and tomatoes were perfectly safe to eat. But to 18th century Europeans, the distinction wasn't clear. If one nightshade plant was poisonous, why wouldn't they all be? Adding fuel to the fire was the tomato's taster, rather, its lack of appeal to northern European palates. Early tomatoes were small, sour, and somewhat bitter, a far cry from the sweet, juicy varieties we enjoy today. Southern Europeans, with their love of bold flavors, embraced the tomato's tanginess and found ways to enhance it with herbs, garlic, and olive oil. But in northern Europe, where the cuisine was milder and more reliant on root vegetables and grains, the tomato's sharp flavor was off-putting. This culinary divide only reinforced the idea that tomatoes were foreign and unsuitable for consumption. And yet, despite all the fear and superstition, tomatoes continued to spread across Europe as food, but as decorative plants. Wealthy landowners grew them in their gardens alongside other exotic imports like tulips and orchids. The plants were admired for their beauty, with their bright red fruits standing out against lush green foliage. But even then, they were treated with caution. People marveled at the tomato's appearance but hesitated to touch or taste it, as if it were a forbidden fruit. It's fascinating to think about how much power appearances and names can hold. The tomato was never inherently dangerous, yet its association with wolves, witches, and poisonous plants made it a symbol of fear. In a way, the tomato was a victim of its own success. Its vibrant color and unusual shape made it stand out. But in a world where anything unfamiliar was suspect, standing out wasn't always a good thing. By the end of the 18th century, tomatoes were firmly entrenched in European gardens, but they hadn't yet made their way to the dinner table, at least not in northern Europe. The fear persisted, fueled by superstition, bad science, and cultural bias. But as we'll see in the next section, the tomato's journey was far from over. It would take a combination of culinary innovation and scientific discovery to transform this wolf peach into the beloved fruit we know today. As the 18th century progressed, the tomato remained trapped in a liminal space, admired for its beauty, but mistrusted as food. However, the tides of history were beginning to turn. The Age of Enlightenment was sweeping across Europe, bringing with it a newfound emphasis on reason, science, and experimentation. Old superstitions were being challenged, and long-held beliefs about the natural world were questioned. It was in this climate of intellectual curiosity that the tomato's reputation began to shift, albeit slowly and unevenly. But before we dive into how the tomato started to redeem itself, let's take a closer look at the cultural divide that kept it in limbo. By the late 1700s, the tomato had found a home in southern European kitchens, particularly in Spain, Italy, and parts of southern France. In these regions, the tomato's tangy flavor was embraced as a complement to local ingredients like garlic, olive oil, and herbs. It was in Italy, in particular, that the tomato began to shine. Southern Italians, especially in the Kingdom of Naples, were early adopters of the tomato as a culinary ingredient. They incorporated it into simple, rustic dishes, often pairing it with pasta or bread. By the mid-18th century, recipes for tomato-based sauces began to appear in Italian cookbooks, marking the beginning of what would eventually become one of the most iconic cuisines in the world. But in Northern Europe, where the climate was colder, the cuisine blander, and the cultural attitudes more conservative, the tomato was still viewed with suspicion. One of the reasons for this divide was the tomato's association with the lower classes. In Southern Europe, tomatoes were cheap and easy to grow, making them a staple for peasants and farmers. But in Northern Europe, where they struggled to ripen, tomatoes were seen as exotic and impractical. They were grown primarily as ornamental plants, displayed in greenhouses or on windowsills as a symbol of wealth and sophistication. Eating them, however, was considered eccentric at best and dangerous at worst. This cultural divide wasn't just about geography, it was also about class. In Northern Europe, where the aristocracy clung to traditional tastes and customs, the tomato's association with the peasantry made it even less appealing. Wealthy diners preferred familiar, safe foods like roasted meats, root vegetables, and bread. The idea of eating a fruit that was not only foreign but also linked to poison and witchcraft was unthinkable. But the Enlightenment was beginning to chip away at these prejudices. Scientists and naturalists, driven by a desire to understand the natural world, began to study the tomato in earnest. They dissected its anatomy, analyzed its chemical properties, and tested its effects on animals and humans. Slowly but surely, the tomato's reputation as a poison apple began to fade. One of the key figures in this transformation was Philip Miller, an English botanist and the author of The Gardener's Dictionary. In the 1768 edition of his book, Miller described the tomato as a plant that was eaten by the Spaniards and Italians as food. While he didn't explicitly recommend eating tomatoes, his neutral tone marked a significant departure from earlier descriptions, which had emphasized the plant's supposed toxicity. Miller's work helped to legitimize the tomato in the eyes of the scientific community, paving the way for further research. At the same time, explorers and traders were bringing back new varieties of tomatoes from the Americas. These varieties were larger, sweeter, and less acidic than the wild tomatoes of earlier centuries, making them more palatable to European tastes. Farmers in southern Europe began to cultivate these new strains, selectively breeding them for size, flavor, and color. By the late 18th century, the tomato had evolved into something much closer to the fruit we know today. But even as scientists and farmers worked to rehabilitate the tomato's image, old fears and superstitions persisted. In rural areas, where Enlightenment ideas were slower to take hold, people continued to view the tomato with suspicion. Stories of aristocrats falling ill after eating tomatoes, likely due to lead poisoning from pewter plates, were still passed down as cautionary tales. And the tomato's association with the nightshade family, with its links to poison and witchcraft, remained a powerful deterrent. It wasn't just the common folk who were wary of tomatoes. Even some members of the scientific community were hesitant to embrace the fruit. In 1774, a German botanist named Johann Gottfried Zinn published a treatise on the tomato, in which he acknowledged its culinary uses in southern Europe, but warned that it might still be harmful in large quantities. Zinn's cautious approach reflected the broader uncertainty of the time. While the tomato was no longer seen as outright deadly, it was still viewed as a risky and exotic novelty. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, a very different story was unfolding. In the American colonies, tomatoes were beginning to gain popularity, thanks in part to their association with the New World. Early American settlers, who were more open to experimenting with unfamiliar foods, began to incorporate tomatoes into their diets. By the late 18th century, tomatoes were being grown in kitchen gardens across the colonies, particularly in the South. One of the most intriguing figures in the tomatoes' American journey was Thomas Jefferson, the third president of the United States and an avid gardener. Jefferson grew tomatoes at his estate in Monticello and is believed to have served them to guests at his dinner table. While Jefferson's influence didn't immediately make tomatoes a mainstream food in America, it did help to legitimize them as a culinary ingredient. Back in Europe, the tomato's gradual acceptance was driven not just by science and exploration, but also by necessity. The late 18th century was a time of upheaval, marked by wars, famines, and economic crises. As traditional food supplies became scarce, people were forced to experiment with new ingredients, including tomatoes. In southern Europe, where the tomato was already a staple, it became even more important as a source of nutrition. And in northern Europe, where hunger often outweighed superstition, the tomato began to find its way onto the plates of the poor. By the end of the 18th century, the tomato was at a crossroads. It was no longer universally feared, but it hadn't yet achieved the widespread acceptance it enjoys today. Its journey from wolf peach to kitchen staple was far from over, but the seeds of change had been planted literally and figuratively. In the next section, we'll explore how the 19th century brought new challenges and opportunities for the tomato, from the rise of industrial agriculture to the invention of canned food. As the 19th century dawned, the world was changing rapidly. Revolutions, industrialization, and scientific breakthroughs were reshaping societies across Europe and the Americas. The tomato, once feared and misunderstood, was poised to take advantage of these transformations. But its journey from wolf peach to culinary staple was still fraught with challenges and a few surprising twists. In Europe, the tomato's reputation continued to improve, thanks in large part to the rise of industrial agriculture and the spread of Enlightenment ideals. Farmers in southern Europe had already been cultivating sweeter, larger tomato varieties by the late 18th century, but the 19th century saw even greater advances in horticulture. Breeders experimented with cross-pollination and selective cultivation, creating tomatoes that were not only more flavorful, but also easier to grow in cooler climates. This was a game changer for northern Europe, where the tomato had struggled to thrive in the past. At the same time, scientific research was dispelling old myths about the tomato's toxicity. By the early 1800s, botanists and chemists had conclusively proven that tomatoes were not poisonous. In fact, they were found to be rich in nutrients like vitamin C, which made them an appealing addition to diets plagued by malnutrition. Medical journals began to recommend tomatoes as a healthful food, particularly for the poor, who often lacked access to fresh fruits and vegetables. But science alone wasn't enough to change public opinion. The tomato's redemption was also driven by cultural shifts, particularly the rise of urbanization and industrialization. As cities grew and populations swelled, traditional food systems struggled to keep up with demand. Urban dwellers needed cheap, nutritious, and easily transportable food, and the tomato fit the bill perfectly. Its bright color and juicy flesh made it appealing to consumers, while its versatility in cooking made it a favorite among chefs and home cooks alike. One of the most significant developments in the tomato's history came in the mid-19th century, the invention of canned food. In 1810, the French inventor Nicolas Appert developed a method for preserving food in airtight containers, which was later refined by British and American entrepreneurs. By the 1850s, canned tomatoes were being produced on a large scale, revolutionizing the way people consumed the fruit. Canned tomatoes were cheap, convenient, and had a long shelf life, making them an essential ingredient in urban kitchens. They also helped to popularize tomato-based dishes like soups, sauces, and stews, which could be prepared quickly and easily. The tomato's rise was further fueled by immigration, particularly to the United States. In the mid-19th century, waves of Italian, Spanish, and Greek immigrants brought their culinary traditions with them, including their love of tomatoes. Italian immigrants, in particular, played a crucial role in transforming the tomato into a symbol of comfort and home. They introduced dishes like spaghetti with tomato sauce, pizza, and lasagna, which quickly became staples of American cuisine. By the late 19th century, tomatoes were firmly entrenched in the American diet, thanks in no small part to the influence of immigrant communities. Back in Europe, the tomato was beginning to shed its foreign label. In Italy, it had already become a cornerstone of regional cuisine, appearing in everything from pasta sauces to soups like zuppa di pomodoro. In France, chefs embraced the tomato as a key ingredient in dishes like ratatouille and soup à la tomate. Even in England, where culinary traditions were more conservative, the tomato found its way into recipes for chutneys, relishes, and soups. Despite these successes, the tomato's journey wasn't entirely smooth. In some parts of Europe, old prejudices lingered, particularly in rural areas where superstition and tradition held sway. Farmers who grew tomatoes for food sometimes faced ridicule or suspicion from their neighbors, who still viewed the fruit as dangerous or untrustworthy. And the tomato's association with the lower classes continued to be a barrier to its acceptance among the aristocracy, who preferred more refined ingredients. But the tomato's popularity was unstoppable. By the late 19th century, it had become a symbol of progress and modernity, embraced by urbanites and intellectuals alike. Cookbooks and magazines began to feature recipes for tomato-based dishes, while restaurants and cafes experimented with new ways to prepare the fruit. The tomato's vibrant color and bold flavor made it a favorite among chefs, who used it to add visual appeal and complexity to their creations. The tomato's transformation wasn't just culinary, it was also cultural. Once feared as a wolf peach, the tomato had become a symbol of abundance, health, and innovation. It was no longer seen as foreign or dangerous. Instead, it was celebrated as a versatile and essential ingredient. This shift was reflected in art and literature, where the tomato appeared as a motif of prosperity and vitality. Painters captured its vivid hue in still life compositions, while writers praised its flavor and nutritional value in essays and poems. By the end of the 19th century, the tomato had achieved what seemed impossible just a century earlier. It had become a beloved staple of European and American cuisine. Its journey from superstition to acceptance was a testament to the power of science, culture, and human ingenuity. But the story doesn't end there. The 20th century would bring new challenges and opportunities for the tomato, from the rise of industrial farming to debates about genetic modification. As you drift off to sleep, imagine the tomato sitting proudly on a kitchen counter, its glossy red skin catching the light. It's hard to believe that this humble fruit was once the subject of fear and suspicion, a victim of its own beauty and mystery. But like many misunderstood things, the tomato found its place in the world, proving that even the most unlikely stories can have a happy ending. And so, the tale of the wolf peach comes to a close for now. Sweet dreams.